We need younger ideas for this 3D printing department. I stood frozen as my new supervisor, a fresh MBA graduate barely 6 months out of school, casually erased 15 years of my experience with a single sentence. At that moment, I could never have predicted that just weeks later, this same young man would come crawling back, begging for my help. My name is Samuel Gray, and at 51, I had dedicated the better part of my career to building Vertex Tech's 3D printing division from the ground up. What started as a modest operation with 2 small desktop printers in a cramped corner of the factory floor had grown into a multi-million-dollar production center that served clients across 3 continents. Every calibration, every process optimization, every troubleshooting protocol bore my fingerprints. The machines hummed with the rhythm I had taught them, responding to adjustments that existed nowhere in manuals, but lived solely in the accumulated wisdom of my experience. Lucas Hartley had joined Vertex Tech just 4 months earlier, armed with his shiny MBA and a head full of theoretical knowledge that had never been tested in the real world. 27 years old, with perfectly pressed suits and an irritating habit of using business jargon in every conversation. He represented everything corporate America seemed to value these days: youth, education credentials, and an unwavering confidence in untested ideas. The morning Lucas delivered his verdict, I had been reviewing the quarterly production reports. Our department had exceeded targets by 12%, maintained a defect rate below 2%, and received commendations from 3 major clients for our innovation in rapid prototyping. The numbers painted a picture of operational excellence that any experienced manager would recognize and preserve. Samuel, I've been analyzing our departmental efficiency metrics, Lucas began, settling into the chair across from my desk with the casual authority of someone who had never doubted his right to be there. While your historical performance data shows consistency, I believe we're missing opportunities for disruptive innovation. The market demands agility, and frankly, I think we need to pivot toward a more dynamic approach. I set down my coffee mug and studied his face, searching for some indication that he understood the implications of what he was suggesting. Lucas, our current processes have been refined over 15 years. Every parameter, every timing sequence, every material specification has been optimized through thousands of hours of trial and error. What specific inefficiencies are you seeing? He waved dismissively, pulling out his tablet to display a colorful presentation filled with buzzwords and generic business graphics. That's exactly the kind of thinking that's holding us back. Samuel, we can't be trapped by legacy processes. I've consulted with several external innovation firms, and they all agree that our approach is too conservative. We need to embrace emerging methodologies, leverage cutting-edge optimization algorithms, and most importantly, we need younger ideas driving this department forward. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Younger ideas, as if wisdom and experience were liabilities rather than assets, as if the countless nights I had spent diagnosing machine failures, the weekends I had sacrificed to meet impossible deadlines. The innovations I had developed through pure necessity meant nothing in the face of theoretical frameworks taught in graduate school classrooms. I see, I said quietly, though I was beginning to understand that this conversation had been decided before it began. And what role do you envision for me in this new direction? Lucas leaned back in his chair, adopting what I assumed he thought was a compassionate expression. Samuel, I want you to know that I respect everything you've built here. Your dedication has been admirable. But moving forward, I think it would be best for everyone if we brought in fresh perspectives. I've already identified several consulting firms staffed by recent engineering graduates who specialize in additive manufacturing optimization. They bring the latest academic research and aren't constrained by conventional thinking. The irony was almost laughable. Conventional thinking had built the department that consistently outperformed projections. Conventional thinking had earned us industry recognition and client loyalty, but apparently, conventional thinking was now the enemy of progress. So, you're firing me, I stated flatly, abandoning any pretense of diplomatic language. I prefer to think of it as creating space for innovation, Lucas replied smoothly. Your severance package will be generous, and of course, you'll receive excellent references. This is about positioning the department for future success, not any reflection on your past contributions. I gathered my personal belongings in silence, methodically emptying drawers that had been mine for over a decade. Family photos, a coffee mug my daughter had given me for Father's Day, the small collection of precision instruments I had accumulated over the years. Each item felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the sudden realization that my professional identity was being packed into a cardboard box. The technical specifications that governed our operations, the carefully documented processes that ensured quality and efficiency, the troubleshooting protocols that had saved countless production runs, all of these existed primarily in my memory. Corporate policy required documentation, of course, but the real knowledge, the intuitive understanding of how our specific machines behaved under different conditions, the subtle signs that preceded failures, the thousands of small adjustments that kept everything running smoothly, that knowledge walked out the door with me. As I carried my box past the production floor, several of my former colleagues looked up from their workstations. Maria, who had started as an intern 8 years ago and had grown into our most skilled technician, gave me a questioning look. I shook my head slightly, and her face fell. Tom, our materials specialist, stepped forward as if to speak, but I kept walking. This was neither the time nor place for emotional farewells or explanations that would only create problems for people who still needed their jobs. The parking garage felt cavernous and empty as I loaded my belongings into my car. 15 years of accumulated knowledge and experience reduced to a single box that fit easily in my trunk. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, staring at the concrete walls and wondering how something that had seemed so permanent could disappear so quickly. Over the following days, I found myself replaying the history of our department, remembering the early challenges and gradual victories that had built our reputation. When I first joined Vertex Tech, 3D printing was still considered an experimental technology, useful primarily for rapid prototyping, but too slow and unreliable for serious production work. The 2 desktop machines we started with were temperamental devices that required constant adjustment and produced parts with visible layer lines and dimensional inconsistencies. I had spent months learning the quirks of those early machines, discovering that each one had its own personality. The Stratasys unit ran hot and needed frequent calibration, but produced excellent surface finishes when properly tuned. The older Dimension printer was more reliable, but required specific environmental conditions to maintain accuracy. Through countless hours of experimentation, I had developed processes that maximized the strengths of each machine while compensating for their weaknesses. As the technology matured and our client base grew, I had advocated for strategic investments in better equipment. Each new machine purchase represented months of research, evaluation, and careful integration into our existing workflow. I had personally trained every technician, developed our quality control procedures, and established the supplier relationships that ensured consistent material quality. The department's growth had not been linear or easy. There had been spectacular failures, costly mistakes, and periods when our future seemed uncertain. A disastrous project with an aerospace client had nearly resulted in a lawsuit until I developed a new post-processing technique that exceeded their original specifications. A contamination incident that ruined an entire production run had led to improved material handling protocols that became industry best practices. Each crisis had taught valuable lessons, and each solution had been incorporated into our collective knowledge base. The young engineers Lucas was bringing in would have access to our documented procedures, but they would lack the contextual understanding that came from living through the evolution of those processes. I tried to push these thoughts aside and focus on moving forward. My severance package provided financial security for several months, and my reputation in the industry was solid enough that finding new employment should not be difficult. Several former colleagues had already reached out with potential opportunities, and I had begun updating my resume and reaching out to my professional network. But part of me remained connected to Vertex Tech, wondering how the transition would unfold. I had left behind not just a job, but a complex system that depended on institutional knowledge and experienced judgment. The new consultants might have impressive academic credentials, but they would be walking into a production environment they had never seen, working with machines they had never operated, serving clients whose specific requirements they had never encountered. 3 days after my departure, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. The caller ID showed Maria's number, and I could hear the tension in her voice before she spoke. "Sam, I'm sorry to bother you, but we're having problems with the object printer. It's producing parts with weird surface artifacts, and the new consultant says it's a software issue, but I think it might be the resin. Lucas told us not to contact you, but I don't know what else to do." I felt a familiar surge of protective concern for the equipment and processes I had spent years perfecting. The object was our most precise machine, capable of producing parts with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, but it was also the most sensitive to environmental conditions and material quality. "Maria, I understand your concern, but Lucas was clear about wanting fresh perspectives. I'm sure the new consultants will figure it out. But Sam, they're talking about completely recalibrating the machine. They want to implement some new algorithm they learned about in a research paper. What if they mess something up?" The question hung in the air between us. I knew exactly what could go wrong with a hasty recalibration of the object. The machine's precision depended on dozens of interdependent parameters, each carefully adjusted to compensate for the specific characteristics of our production environment. Changing one setting without understanding its relationship to all the others could create cascading problems that might take weeks to diagnose and correct. "Maria, you know I can't interfere with Lucas's decisions. If you're concerned, document everything before they make changes. Take photos, record the current settings, and make sure you have a way to restore the original configuration if necessary." I ended the call feeling frustrated and helpless. 15 years of accumulated knowledge was walking away from problems I could solve in minutes, simply because someone with an MBA had decided that experience was less valuable than theoretical innovation. 2 days later, Tom called with similar concerns about our largest production machine, a custom-built system we had developed in partnership with the manufacturer. The new consultants wanted to update its control software to incorporate machine learning algorithms that promised to optimize print parameters automatically. "Sam, this is crazy," Tom said, his voice tight with anxiety. "They're talking about letting an AI system adjust temperature, speed, and layer height based on some predictive model, but they don't understand that our machine has been modified. The manufacturer's standard algorithms won't work with our custom extruder assembly." I closed my eyes, picturing the complex arrangement of heating elements, sensors, and mechanical components that made our custom system unique. We had spent 2 years working with the manufacturer's engineers to develop modifications that allowed us to print with specialized materials that our competitors couldn't handle. The control software had been carefully tuned to work with these modifications, and any significant changes could potentially damage expensive components or create safety hazards. "Tom, you need to document your concerns and present them to Lucas. If he's determined to proceed, make sure everything is properly backed up. And for everyone's safety, don't let them make changes to the heating control algorithms without consulting the manufacturer." I tried talking to Lucas, but he says I'm being resistant to change. He actually used the phrase legacy thinking when I explained why the standard algorithms won't work. Legacy thinking. Another phrase that dismissed experience as an obstacle rather than recognizing it as a valuable resource. I wondered if Lucas had ever considered that some thinking became legacy because it had proven effective over time, refined through cycles of implementation, evaluation, and improvement. The calls continued throughout the following week. Different machines, different problems, but always the same underlying issue. The new consultants were implementing changes without understanding the specific context of our production environment. They had academic knowledge of 3D printing principles, but they lacked the experiential knowledge of how those principles applied to our unique combination of equipment, materials, and client requirements. Each conversation left me more conflicted. I wanted to help my former colleagues, but I also recognized that my involvement would undermine Lucas's authority and potentially create political problems for people who still needed their jobs. I had been dismissed as obsolete, and any attempt to insert myself back into the situation would validate Lucas's narrative about resistance to change. By the end of the second week, The problems had escalated beyond individual machine issues. According to Maria, production schedules were falling behind as the team struggled with equipment that no longer performed reliably. Quality control was rejecting an increasing percentage of parts, and 2 clients had expressed concerns about delayed deliveries. Lucas had responded by bringing in additional consultants and implementing what he called aggressive optimization protocols. This apparently involved running multiple experimental processes simultaneously, treating the production floor as a laboratory for testing theoretical improvements. Sam, I know you said not to call, but I'm really worried. Maria said during what would be our final conversation from her work phone. They've got 3 different teams making changes to different machines, and nobody's coordinating with each other. The Stratasys is running some new temperature profile that's causing warping problems. The Fortis has been down for 2 days because they tried to install beta software that crashed the control system, and they want to completely rebuild the support structures on the big custom machine. I could hear the desperation in her voice, the frustration of someone who understood the problems but lacked the authority to solve them. Maria, I wish I could help, but my hands are tied. Lucas made it clear that my approach was holding the department back. I have to trust that he knows what he's doing. But Sam, what if he doesn't? What if this whole thing falls apart? It was a question I had been asking myself, and I was beginning to suspect I would soon learn the answer. The breaking point came 3 weeks after my departure, announced not by a phone call from a former colleague, but by an unexpected email from Lucas himself. The subject line read, "Consulting opportunity, urgent," and the tone was markedly different from our previous interactions. Samuel, I hope this message finds you well. I wanted to reach out regarding some technical challenges we're currently facing in the 3D printing department. While our innovation initiatives are showing promise, we've encountered some unexpected complications that might benefit from additional expertise. Would you be available for a brief consultation? I believe your historical knowledge of our systems could provide valuable context for resolving these issues. I read the email 3 times, noting the careful language that avoided admitting failure while clearly indicating desperation. The phrase, historical knowledge, was particularly telling, transforming what had been dismissed as obsolete thinking into a valuable resource. I waited 24 hours before responding, not out of spite, but because I needed time to consider my options carefully. Lucas had made his position clear when he fired me, and any involvement on my part would need to be on terms that protected my professional reputation and acknowledged the value of my expertise. My response was brief and professional. Lucas, I appreciate you reaching out. I would be willing to discuss a consulting arrangement. Given the urgent nature of the situation, my rate would be $200 per hour with a minimum commitment of 40 hours. Please let me know if you'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the specific technical challenges. The rate was deliberately high, nearly 3 times what the company had been paying for my full-time services. I expected Lucas to negotiate or look for alternatives, but his response came within 2 hours. Samuel, your terms are acceptable. Can you come in tomorrow morning at 8 a.m.? The situation has become quite serious. Walking back into the Vertex Tech facility felt surreal, like returning to a home that had been redecorated by strangers. The security guard who had watched me leave 3 weeks earlier now signed me in as a visitor, issuing a temporary badge that felt like a symbol of my changed status. The production floor that had once hummed with efficient activity now looked like a scene from a disaster movie. The Stratasys printer sat idle with its control panel displaying an error message I had never seen before. The Fortis machine was partially disassembled, its housing panels removed to expose the internal mechanisms. Most concerning was the custom system, which appeared to be running some kind of test program that was producing parts with obvious defects. Maria spotted me first, her face lighting up with relief. Sam, thank God you're here. It's been a nightmare. Before I could respond, Lucas appeared at my side, looking considerably less confident than he had during our last encounter. His usually perfect appearance showed signs of strain, wrinkled shirt, loosened tie, and dark circles under his eyes that suggested he had been spending long hours dealing with crisis after crisis. Samuel, thank you for coming so quickly, he said, extending his hand in a gesture that felt both formal and desperate. I think we may have underestimated the complexity of transitioning to new optimization protocols. I shook his hand, but kept my expression neutral. What exactly has been happening? Lucas led me to a conference room where 3 young consultants sat around a table covered with laptops, printouts, and coffee cups. They looked up as we entered, their expressions ranging from curious to defensive. Samuel, meet the team from Adaptive Manufacturing Solutions, Lucas said. They've been working around the clock to implement our new efficiency protocols. The lead consultant, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, stood to shake my hand. Mr. Gray, I'm Jennifer Chen. We've heard a lot about your work here. I have to say, some of your legacy processes were quite innovative for their time. For their time? Another phrase that dismissed 15 years of refinement and optimization as historical curiosities. I nodded politely, but said nothing. Jennifer's team has identified several opportunities for improvement, Lucas continued, but we've encountered some unexpected technical obstacles. The machines aren't responding to the new parameters as predicted by the optimization models. I looked around the room at the laptops displaying various software interfaces, most of which I didn't recognize. What specific problems are you experiencing? Jennifer pulled up a presentation on her laptop, displaying graphs and charts that meant nothing without context. We've been implementing adaptive learning algorithms to optimize print parameters in real time. The theoretical models suggest we should be able to improve efficiency by 30% while reducing material waste by 20%. Theoretical models, I repeated. And what are the actual results? The room fell silent. Jennifer clicked to the next slide, which showed production statistics that painted a very different picture. Efficiency had dropped by 40%, defect rates had increased by a factor of 6, and material waste had actually increased due to the high number of failed prints. There seemed to be some environmental factors that weren't accounted for in our models, Jennifer admitted. The machines are producing results that don't match our predictive algorithms. I walked over to the window that overlooked the production floor, studying the machines that had once operated with clockwork precision. Have you considered that your models might be based on ideal conditions that don't exist in a real production environment? What do you mean? Asked one of the other consultants, a young man with thick glasses and an eager expression. Those machines have been running in this specific environment for years. The temperature varies by season. Humidity affects material properties. Vibrations from the factory floor influence print quality. And each machine has developed its own characteristics over time. Your optimization algorithms are trying to apply universal solutions to systems that have been customized for very specific conditions. Jennifer frowned at her laptop screen. But the algorithm should be able to adapt to environmental variables. That's the whole point of machine learning optimization. Only if they have enough data to learn from, and only if they understand the relationships between all the variables. How much historical data did you feed into your models? We use the standard data sets from the equipment manufacturers, plus some academic research databases. I turned back to face the room. What about the data from our actual production runs? The logs from our specific machines, running our specific materials, producing parts for our specific clients? The silence that followed answered my question. They had ignored the most relevant data source because it represented the legacy thinking they were trying to replace. Jennifer, I think we need to take a step back and reassess our approach, Lucas said, his voice carrying the strain of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of his mistake. Over the next hour, I toured the production floor with Lucas and Jennifer, examining each machine and listening to descriptions of the changes that had been implemented. The picture that emerged was one of systematic disruption of processes that had been working effectively for years. The Stratasys printer was experiencing temperature control issues because the new algorithms were adjusting heating parameters too aggressively, causing thermal stress that led to part warping. The Fortis machine had been upgraded with beta software that promised improved speed but created compatibility problems with our specific material profiles. The custom system was running experimental support structure algorithms that used more material while providing less structural integrity. Each change by itself might have been manageable. I explained to Lucas as we stood beside the idle Stratasys machine. But you've implemented multiple changes simultaneously across interconnected systems. When everything is changing at once, it becomes impossible to diagnose problems or predict interactions. So what would you recommend? Lucas asked. I looked at the machines that had once been my responsibility, considering the scope of the work required to restore functionality. First, we need to stop making changes and stabilize what we have. Then we need to systematically restore the baseline configurations that were working before. Only after we have stable operations can we consider implementing improvements one at a time. How long would that take? If we work around the clock, maybe 2 weeks to get back to baseline functionality, but there's another problem that might be more serious than the technical issues. Lucas's face tightened. What kind of problem? I pulled out my phone and showed him a news article I had found that morning. The headline read, "Quantum Print Corp announces revolutionary new production techniques." The article described innovations that sounded remarkably similar to proprietary processes that Vertex Tech had developed over the past several years. Someone has been sharing our technical information with competitors, I said quietly. The timing is too coincidental. These innovations were announced just weeks after your new consultants gained access to our systems. Jennifer stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. Are you suggesting that we've been sharing confidential information? That's a serious accusation. I'm not accusing anyone of deliberate industrial espionage. I replied calmly. But when you bring in multiple external consultants and give them access to proprietary systems, information security becomes a concern. Have you conducted background checks on everyone who has had access to our production data? Lucas looked stricken. I assumed that was handled by HR as part of the consulting agreements. Did you verify that assumption? The answer was clearly no, written across Lucas's face in growing horror. I continued examining the news article, noting specific technical details that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of our processes. There's something else, I said, scrolling through my phone to find another article. Look at this announcement from Quantum Print about their new client acquisitions. 3 of these companies were in negotiations with us just last month. Lucas read over my shoulder, his complexion growing paler with each client name. How could they have known about our pending contracts? That information would have been in the project files that the consultants needed access for their optimization work. If there's a security breach, it goes beyond just technical specifications. The implications were staggering. Not only had the optimization project failed to improve efficiency, but it had potentially compromised years of competitive advantage and business development. The situation had moved beyond operational problems into the realm of corporate catastrophe. Samuel, I need your help, Lucas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not just with the machines, but with all of this. I think I've made a terrible mistake. I looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the arrogant young MBA who had dismissed my experience, but a person who was genuinely overwhelmed by consequences he had never anticipated. The decision I made in that moment would determine not just my own future, but the future of people who had been my colleagues and friends for years. Lucas, I'll help you fix this, but we need to establish some ground rules. First, I need complete authority over the technical recovery process. No more changes without my approval, no more experimental protocols, and no more external consultants until we understand the security situation. Second, my team needs to include people who understand these systems, which means bringing back some of the experienced technicians who were sidelined during the optimization project. Third, we need to conduct a complete audit of information security and determine exactly what data may have been compromised. Agreed, Lucas said immediately. Whatever you need. The consulting rate we discussed applies to the full scope of this project. Given the urgency and complexity, I estimate a minimum of 80 hours over the next 2 weeks, with potential for additional time if we discover more problems. Understood. And Lucas, when this is over, I want a public acknowledgement that the optimization project was unsuccessful and that the recovery required the knowledge and experience that you initially dismissed, not for my ego, but because the people who work here deserve to understand that their expertise has value. Lucas nodded, though I could see the political implications weighing on him. I'll make sure that happens. Over the next 2 weeks, I essentially lived at Vertex Tech, working 16-hour days to systematically undo months of misguided optimization. The process was like archaeological restoration, carefully removing layers of modifications to uncover the original configurations that had proven effective over years of operation. Maria and Tom were invaluable partners in this effort. Their detailed knowledge of day-to-day operations, filling in gaps that might have taken me weeks to rediscover on my own. Other experienced technicians who had been marginalized during the optimization project contributed insights that proved crucial to understanding the full scope of the problems. The security audit revealed the extent of the information compromise. The consulting team from Adaptive Manufacturing Solutions had been using cloud-based collaboration tools to share data and coordinate their work. While convenient for their purposes, these tools had created pathways for sensitive information to be accessed by unauthorized parties. The investigation revealed that Jennifer Chen had previously worked for a company that had been acquired by Quantum Print just months before she joined Adaptive Manufacturing Solutions. While there was no evidence of deliberate espionage, the connections raised serious questions about how confidential information had found its way to our competitors. More troubling was the discovery that the consulting team had been documenting not just technical specifications, but also business processes, client relationships, and strategic planning information. Their comprehensive approach to understanding our operations had inadvertently created a detailed blueprint of our competitive advantages. As the machines gradually returned to reliable operation, I began working on countermeasures to mitigate the competitive damage. Using my knowledge of our proprietary processes, I developed modified versions that would produce similar results through different methods. More importantly, I identified ways to create disinformation that would mislead competitors who were relying on stolen data. The disinformation campaign was subtle but effective. I created false technical specifications that appeared legitimate but contained critical flaws that would cause problems for anyone attempting to implement them. These were embedded in system documentation and backup files that had been accessed by the consulting team. Within a month of implementing these countermeasures, Quantum Print began experiencing production problems that were reported in industry publications. Their attempt to rapidly implement processes based on stolen information had backfired, creating quality control issues that damaged their reputation with key clients. The satisfaction I felt watching our competitors struggle with flawed information was tempered by the recognition that this entire situation could have been avoided with better judgment and more respect for institutional knowledge. By the end of the recovery period, all machines were operating at or above their previous performance levels, production schedules were back on track, quality control metrics had returned to acceptable ranges, and client relationships had been stabilized through careful communication and delivery of promised products. The public acknowledgement Lucas had promised came in the form of a company-wide meeting where he explained that the optimization project had been unsuccessful and that the recovery had required the expertise of experienced technicians and my consulting services. While he avoided explicitly admitting that firing me had been a mistake, the implication was clear to everyone present. But the real validation came from industry recognition. Word of the successful recovery spread through professional networks, and I began receiving inquiries from other companies facing similar challenges with misguided optimization projects. The consulting opportunities that emerged from this work were more lucrative and intellectually satisfying than my previous corporate position. 6 months later, I was sitting in the office of my own consulting firm reviewing proposals for several major projects. The phone rang, and the caller identified himself as the CEO of a manufacturing company that had recently hired a young MBA to modernize their production processes. "Mr. Gray, we've heard about your work at Vertex Tech," he said. "We're facing some similar challenges with our new optimization initiatives. Would you be available for a consultation?" I smiled, remembering Lucas's confidence in younger ideas and the expensive lesson he had learned about the value of experience. "I'd be happy to help," I replied. "But first, let me ask you a question. How much institutional knowledge are you planning to preserve during this modernization process?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean that innovation and experience aren't opposites. The most successful modernization projects find ways to combine new technologies with proven processes. Before you change everything, make sure you understand why the current systems work the way they do. As I scheduled the consultation, I reflected on the lessons that had emerged from the Vertex Tech experience. Youth and education were valuable assets, but they were most effective when combined with experience and wisdom. The future belonged not to those who dismissed the past, but to those who could build upon it thoughtfully and strategically. The irony was not lost on me that the younger ideas Lucas had sought had ultimately led him back to the knowledge and experience he had initially rejected. In trying to discard the past, he had nearly destroyed the foundation upon which any successful future would need to be built. True innovation, I had learned, required not just fresh thinking, but also deep understanding. The most valuable ideas emerged from the intersection of new possibilities and proven principles. Where imagination was tempered by wisdom and enthusiasm was guided by experience. As I prepared for my next consulting engagement, I carried with me not just technical knowledge, but also a deeper appreciation for the complex relationship between innovation and tradition. The future would belong to those who could navigate this relationship skillfully, respecting the past while embracing the possibilities of tomorrow. The young executives who sought to replace experience with enthusiasm would continue to make expensive mistakes until they learned what Lucas had learned: that some knowledge cannot be taught in classrooms or captured in algorithms. Some wisdom can only be earned through years of solving real problems in the real world, where theoretical models meet practical constraints and where success depends not just on what you know, but on what you understand.